Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. We would like to address some points from Azrienoch. Sir, you have exposed yourself in public, and I will now draw attention to your nudity. Let's just have one or two quick words at the beginning here on intellectual discourse. Among us real intellectuals, unlike posturing sophists such as Azrienoch, Spook and company, Zorio, scientific discussion, let me not continue. Unlike those posturing sophists, real intellectuals like myself interact in the following way in public discourse. If there's a statement or a view that is put forward by a colleague, and the case isn't convincingly made by that colleague, then we step forward and bring our own abilities and efforts to bear in order to clarify the subject. Each person contributes a piece to the ultimate pie. Some people contribute more than others. I invite you gentlemen to come in to that kitchen someday. Quit playing with mud pies out back. So what do I mean by that metaphor? In that metaphor, real philosophy and actual thought among real humans is happening in a kitchen where there are actual ingredients in the cupboards and stuff. Spook and Azrienoch are out back throwing mud at each other and telling me that I'm a posturing 3-year-old. So let us look into this a bit. Intellectuals who are serious hold it as their occupation to clarify ideas for the public, whatever ideas they think are important for whatever subject. That tradition of intellectualism does not hold in the universities. So maybe it's best if you gentlemen just go back to the university crowd and just talk amongst yourselves and leave us real intellectuals to the discourse that needs to be taken care of in the world. There are things that need to be talked about, and you are not helping. So let us look into clarifications that they offer. I don't know who they are. It's Azrienoch and his buddy in a video called Stitching a Sock for Mr. Cropper or something. Really disastrous video. So remembering now that an intellectual's function is to clarify and elaborate thoughts which he finds important, useful, worthwhile, remembering that. Quoting from the video. Let's see, I believe this is the first guy, not Az. We'll call them Az and B. B says, quote, "As for the stitched together comment," coming now from that silly metaphor that Spook gave and never even explained or finished. "As for the stitched together comment, Cropper, you're falling prey to your own devices." No explanation. "We've come to the agreement that updated ideas and philosophy is what's missing from your argument. You can't take ancient ideas and ignore all progress and wind up in a conclusion based on those old ideas. It's not only irresponsible, it's and switch to Azrienoch. Before we go on and try to get something from Azrienoch, let's look at this a little bit here. So he says, I'm falling prey to my own devices insofar as I didn't understand the stitched together comment, and no explanation. He says we've come to an agreement that him and Azrienoch, that updated ideas and philosophy is what's missing from your argument. So I'm using these old, outdated ideas, he says. Now he doesn't offer any argument against any of my arguments. He doesn't offer any defense of Spook. So he's just skipped past what intellectuals do. And then what he does is he goes straight to a fallacy and says, your ideas are old and outdated. Gentlemen, serious intellectuals at work here, run along and play now. But let us continue for those of us who are still in the conversation for what we might learn. Switch to Azrienoch talking now. He talks about Aristotelian logic for a bit, and about how Aristotle would be upset if 2,000 years later all we knew about logic was what he had known. He says, quote, "You're clinging to outdated methods of knowledge, of analysis, an outdated view of the world." No argument about my arguments, no clarification, no rebuttal, not offering any line of thought. He's not offering any syllogisms. He's just saying it's outdated. Continuing, "The world you live in no longer has the ability to recognize what it is that you think. We don't live in that era." End quote. Switch to Buddy. So far there's no intellectual content here at all. And maybe these gentlemen wouldn't mind just coming out and admitting, okay, Mr. Cropper's an intellectual and we are not. Maybe they would admit that. Continuing, switch to Buddy, he says some stuff, quote, "You have to realize once your philosophy has been ripped apart and shown to be false, you have to either," okay, now, he never shows how my philosophy is ripped apart, shown false, and they dispute the methodology that would allow you to rip a philosophy apart. These old methods of logic, this old style of argument, where you have to concretize everything, where you can't just have a floating metaphor that means nothing. This old style, you would have to use that old style to rip a philosophy apart. They're saying they've done it, and they've repudiated the style which would allow them to do that. Have they ripped apart and shown this philosophy to be false? The philosophy of rationality, Aristotelianism, objectivism. So anyways, he continues, shown to be false. He said, you have to either, I understand the fight for it, it takes a lot of courage. Maybe that's what you're lacking. Incoherent gibberish. If I'm lacking courage, they are lacking a brain. They're open-minded. Their brain fell out. That's the problem here, isn't it? And he says, I'm lacking the courage. Maybe Cropper, maybe you're lacking the courage to admit that there is sections of philosophical thought that begin and end. So they're not going to offer any argument for their position. They're not going to give any rhetorical statement whatsoever. They're just going to say that I don't realize something that they realize. Don't you understand, Cropper? That's a fallacy too, guys. Come on. And with progress, it makes sense to have a different era in thinking altogether. We have held the old ideologies in the past, and they are no longer relevant, not only for the time we're living in, but for the transgression of thought through the course of history. It's not going to be any concretization or explanation of that, of course. That will remain floating as it is floating in his own mind. He doesn't understand himself what he just said. It's intellectual posturing of the most absurd kind. If anybody calls them on it, they're stuck. They can't explain themselves at all. I challenge him to explain that bit of gibberish there, that old ideologies that were held in the past are no longer relevant. Which ideologies? Like logic and reason? Are you seriously going to hold that view? You probably do. Azrienoch then quotes from de Spook. So switching over to Azrienoch, he says that de Spook's unclarity is my responsibility. Says that I have to ask the questions and whatever. Then he says, in every instance when de Spook is using a metaphor, he gives you more than one way of putting it. He gives you a metaphor and simile, etc., and you triangulate his meaning. And he says, my responsibility in this conversation to triangulate de Spook's meaning from all of the hints and clues he gives me. I take it as my responsibility as an intellectual to be as clear as I can when I'm speaking for whatever case it is that I'm speaking for. That is something that you gentlemen have lost or never had. The idea that intellectualism has to have something